So now we continue in chapter 9 with Paul's continuing argument. Just by way of review, we ended with, so then, this election or inclusion or choosing, depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. It's His choice because He's giving something more or better than what people deserve. Now, he continues, for the scripture says to Pharaoh in Exodus 9:16, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then, He, God, has mercy on whomever He wills, and He hardens whoever He wills. So, originally, he was talking about God having mercy on those who have mercy, compassion on those on whom He have compassion. Now he's saying mercy on whom He wills, and He hardens whom He wills. But we need to understand how the story with Pharaoh worked. Pharaoh hardened his own heart time and time again. Pharaoh was the one being stubborn, but God was overwhelming him with His power and His awesomeness. And it reached a point where Pharaoh, though his desire was to remain stubborn toward God, he was unable to do so. And so God sort of enabled him to continue in his stubbornness. And so, in a sense, it's almost like He was having mercy on Pharaoh, and He was indeed hardening Pharaoh's heart, but it wasn't against his will. Pharaoh wasn't some, lifeless puppet just doing whatever God said. And we know this because as soon as all the plagues were over, Israel gathers up all the stuff and leaves. They head out of town. Pharaoh's sitting there by himself, and what does he do? He immediately says, oh no, I've screwed up. I've got to go back and get him. I should have never let him leave. His heart is hard immediately, again, as soon as God's overwhelming power is out of the picture. So anyway, that's Pharaoh, and Paul understands, okay, so if you're giving me this example about Pharaoh, you will say to me then, well, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? Of course, we just explained that would be misinterpreting what God did with Pharaoh. But Paul answers, but who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? And this is referring back to Isaiah 29:16, 45:9. And Paul, he's trying to make the point that God is the creator. All of this is within His power to do anything He wants. Where do you get off questioning Him? But let's put it in Paul's words. He continues in verse 21, has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump? And in context here, Paul's talking about the people of Israel. Make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use. Does the potter have that right? Well, just logically, we would think of that and go, yeah, sure. He's the potter. He can do what he wants. Quick note, honorable and dishonorable. I think in context here, he's probably talking about the godly versus the ungodly. It's very much in tune with what we see in 2 Timothy 2:20 and how it's used there. But it could also be, in this particular case, he's talking about honorable being like spiritual Israel, and dishonorable being unbelieving physical Israel. And in fact, upon reflection, that's probably the more appropriate context here. But Paul continues with what I think is a hypothetical, and we can see even the text reads, what if, which of course sounds hypothetical, right? But I'll explain what I mean as we go. Paul writes, what if God, desiring to show His wrath and to make known His power, which sounds an awful lot like what he was doing with Pharaoh. What if, desiring to do that, he has endured with much patience vessels of wrath like Pharaoh, except now among his people Israel, vessels of wrath prepared for destruction in the coming judgment? And I need to point this out because the word prepared is going to be used twice, and you need to know that the underlying Greek, they're different words, and it's important for the understanding. This word prepared means like to be complete or to be made ready. And it doesn't even necessarily require that it is God that has done it. They may have made themselves ready. So God endures with patience vessels of wrath, just like he did with Pharaoh, except now they're among his people Israel. And these vessels of wrath that he's enduring they've been made complete. They've been made ready for destruction in the coming judgment, even if it was their own doing. So what if God was doing that in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy among his people Israel, just like he did back in the Egypt story? And these vessels of mercy which he has prepared beforehand for glory. Now that prepared beforehand points back to what he was talking about in chapter 8 about being predestined for glory, to be in the image of his Son. So what if God did that in order to make his riches known for the vessels of mercy? And then he clarifies, even us, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. And he's going to use some arguments to prove that point. But the hypothetical is this. Okay, so God did this to Pharaoh. Well, what if he's doing the same thing now? What if he's, instead of doing it for you, Israel, what if he's doing it in you, Israel? What if God is saying, I'm going to take your stubbornness and I am going to help you to continue to walk in it for my purposes? It's a pretty crazy question, right? But then he now goes off and wants to address this idea of the vessels of mercy being not just some of Israel, but some of Israel and even some from the nations, some of the Gentiles. So he starts to argue in verse 25, as indeed he says in Hosea 2:23, those who were not my people I will call my people, and her who was not beloved I will call beloved. A couple things about that. We see a very similar usage of this scripture in 1 Peter 2:10. And what's important about it is in Hosea, this has nothing to do with Gentiles. This is all about northern Israel, southern Israel, Israel versus Judah, that kind of thing. But Paul and Peter, they're using it differently. They're using it to say God-fearing Gentiles in the place of northern Israel. And he continues, and in the very place where it was said to them, that would be the Gentile believers in Paul's new interpretation, you are not my people, it also says, there they will be called sons of the living God. So again, also in Hosea, it's just back in chapter 1, verse 10. And he continues, more evidence. And Isaiah cries out in chapter 10, verses 22 and 23 concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel may be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And finally, and as Isaiah chapter 1 verse 9 predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. This also sort of relates to what we see in Matthew chapter 10 verse 15, talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. But the basic idea is that there would be no offspring. Sodom and Gomorrah, it came to nothing. It was just desolation. So this is all Paul arguing that, the vessels of mercy would be not just from Israel, but also from the nations. And so then, and this is so important, what shall we say then? Okay, we have seen this time and time and time again. What is Paul doing? He's going to present a false premise. And he does. It relates back to verses 22 to 24 when he was talking about what if God had done this thing where he had used a portion of Israel in the same way he used Pharaoh. He used their stubbornness the same way he used his stubbornness. We get to verse 30 and Paul says, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is a righteousness that is by faith. But Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law of righteousness? By no means. It's important that we see that as a false premise. Now, there is a measure of truth in it, in that, well, yeah, some of Israel is not reaching it. And yeah, Gentiles did obtain it. But it's not just, yeah, I'm going to dump Israel and I'm going to take all the Gentiles, even though they don't pursue righteousness at all. It's nothing like that. And you will see as Paul continues his argument. But he goes on and tries to explain, except, again, in perfect Paul fashion, he just says, why? Which doesn't really help us. What he's saying is, okay, so why and how then do we explain how some Jews have forfeited the redemption while some Gentiles have acquired it? And then it's the same argument he's been making all along. Because they, some of the Jews, did not pursue it, that is the law of righteousness, by faith. But they pursued it as if it were based on works. And we don't mean works of righteousness like loving your neighbor. It's works of legal status of being Jewish. They thought because they were ethnically Jewish that they were okay, but that's not how it works. And then he continues, and this is very important, they have stumbled over the stumbling stone of Messiah. And then Paul explains exactly what that is. As it is written in Isaiah 28:16, behold, I am laying in Zion, that's in the midst of Israel, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. And we see the same verse and the same application from Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 to 8. What Paul is saying in chapter 9 is, listen, I want nothing more than for all of my Jewish brothers to come to believe that this is the Messiah and to walk in this new reality. But they're not, and it makes me sad, but there's a reason for it. God chooses whomever he wills, and it's already been predicted and told that Israel was going to stumble, and it was going to be for the sake of the nations, which we'll see as his argument continues. Now, the other thing in chapter 9 that we see, it seems like, man, this is pretty rough on Israel. It's pretty rough on the Jews who don't believe. And Paul, it's somewhat of a pattern with him. He will say something that is provocative and harsh, and then while he's explaining with it, he seems to mellow a little bit as we go. And we'll see some of that in chapter 10 and chapter 11. But this is at least the first part of Paul's arguments regarding the unbelieving of Israel. So we'll see as he continues in chapter 10.